But there's a problem. I just shifted everything over to the left there. But there's a problem with this. Anyone know what the problem is that's coming next year? Oh, good. The NCTE standards are being rewritten. The NCTE standards just went before the SASB board back in October, and there were some issues. There's some revisions that need to happen. Mathematics as well. So in 2013, we are going to see a new set of national standards for English, and we're going to see a new set of national standards for mathematics just about the time that the Common Core are coming online. And they're going to look something like this. These are the new English standards. Don't take a picture of this because they are still in draft form, so they are not to be passed about. But this is the language of the new SPA standards, the new NCTE standards, and there are sub-elements within them. They're actually a little less cumbersome than the original set, and they're a pretty good set of standards. Teacher preparation programs have looked at them. English teachers across the country have looked at them. They're not all that different from the first set of NCTE standards. The language is changing to more clearly map onto the Common Core. So the standards are written more about what candidate expectations are in light of student learning, more so than the original NCTE standards. But we need to hold off a little bit trying to do that gap analysis to the NCTE standards because the original NCTE standards ultimately are going away. So the gap analysis has to focus on the front end. So when we talk about gap analysis and trying to figure out where the commonalities are, in the state of Missouri, this is what we're doing towards teacher preparation. And it's begging a larger question of, and I'm going to get to this here in just a second, what is the role of standards in accreditation? Now, what I was going to show you at this point, and I'm not going to pull it up on this PowerPoint, is actually show you what the spreadsheet looks like, but it's a relatively straightforward process. In one column of our Excel spreadsheet, we have listed all of the state standards, and then in the middle section, we have listed all of the Common Core, and then on the right-hand column, we have listed all of the NCTE. And actually, what I put on that sheet is the current NCTE standards and then the new NCTE standards that are coming on. The new standards will be adopted in 2013. Institutions will have 2 years to transition over into them. Like I said, we can't wait that long to adopt these particular standards. So what we want to do is map all 4 sets of standards and look for where there are commonalities and ultimately where there are gaps, where we are not addressing the kinds of things that we're seeing in the Common Core and the expectations of college readiness the students in Missouri are going to have. So this leads us to the next steps. And in many ways, I think this is the most important thing that we need to think about. Where ultimately, once we have this gap analysis set, do we need to go? And the first thing is to complete the gap analysis, and that should be done later this spring, at least as an initial draft that we can begin to share with our constituent parties. We need to share the work with practitioners. We need to get out into the schools and share this gap analysis and get some feedback from recent graduates, from teachers who have been in the field for a while, administrators, parents, administrators. Where are we right and where are we wrong? Because we're drawing some assumptions on student performance and what they can do versus what a teacher candidate must know. And then we must determine the relationship between the current teacher-based standards that we have and the student performance-based. And this is going to mean needing to develop some kind of an assessment instrument that shows if a teacher candidate knows X, Y, and Z, students will be able to perform well on X, Y, and Z. And this leads me back when I was chair of an English department for 10 years, a high school English department. And I remember walking around and popping in and watching teachers teach. And we had one teacher in our school, really, really dynamic, good English teacher. And I went in and I just wanted to see what was going on that day. And they were reading Hamlet. And he was having his students recite passages from Shakespeare. So he had pulled a number of sections from Hamlet and a couple from Macbeth, and students got to pick, and a number of them got up and had to do the famous to be or not to be speech, and they had to memorize it and they had to perform it. And it was a really interesting dynamic class, and the students got into it and they were having fun. Some of them were in costume, some of them weren't. And I asked him after the class, and I said, wow, that was really great. Why were they doing that again? What was the learning objective that you were trying to get out of this? And he said, well, they learn Shakespeare better when they memorize it. And I thought, okay, why? What is it about the process of memorizing lines of Shakespeare? Because I can memorize Russian and not know what the hell I'm saying, but I can still memorize it. But it doesn't mean that I'm learning it. It doesn't mean that I'm processing it. And he didn't have a really good answer for me at the time. And I believe that having students recite is an effective tool for getting them to process things on a higher level. But he was having a difficult time articulating, having students, or having the students do something, and what was the learning objective attached to it. And it's the same thing here. Determining the relationship between the standards. We're having our teacher candidates and our new teachers in school do a certain thing. But are we really clear how that relates ultimately to the outcomes that we expect? And that's one of the assessment pieces from a teacher preparation standpoint that we need to begin to address. And we need to identify where there may be gaps in this preparation. That, in other words, is there knowledge, is there skills, are there performance expectations that teachers need that we are not ultimately providing to them? And this might be one of the most important considerations to have when we talk about being very targeted in the kinds of information that we need to get to our teacher candidates. As an example, if we are going to reevaluate the standards and say, do we need a new set of standards that are more closely in line with the Common Core? We need to ask ourselves, well, what do our teachers need based on student performance? One of the issues that we see in Missouri is we had a standard set aside for technology. In other words, teachers needed to be trained in using technology. And what we found, working with students and working with districts across the state of Missouri, is that's not an issue. In fact, our teacher candidates were spending more time training us as professors how to use the technology than we were ultimately spending training them. And so we ask ourselves the question, well, wouldn't we be better off using that time for something else? And so in the state of Missouri, the technology standard ultimately has gone away. It's been embedded in other things. We don't need that separate kind of standard. This is the kind of self-reflection I think we ultimately need to do as we begin to put this gap analysis into play. We need to reevaluate the role of standards in teacher preparation. And I think we need to do this both at a state level and at a national level. One of the conversations we're having at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Missouri is, where do standards play out in the accreditation process? Do we need a specific set of content standards in Missouri? Can we simply go with the Common Core standards as an expectation for accountability and accreditation? Or do we need to set some other set of standards in place against the Common Core for accountability of new teachers? NCATE and TEAC, was mentioned last night, have now merged into CAPE. They're one organization. And the accreditation process isn't that drastically different between those two organizations, but now you have two umbrellas with which you can work. That under the umbrella of CAPE, there is a process that looks very similar to the NCATE process, the old NCATE SPA process. And the SPA review is not going away. It's still a part of that strand. But then there is also more of the TEAC strand of accreditation. And where they're looking for is that commonality between the two. So they're not competing accreditation bodies, but they're actually working toward the same goal. Excuse me. But within that, there's also under CAPE what's called the Option 2 for program review. And the Option 2 says that programs can develop their own assessment systems. That for those of you that are familiar with the NCATE SPA review process, where you have very rigidly defined 6 to 8 assessments ultimately that you're going to use, with this idea of reevaluating the role of standards in accreditation, there is an option built into the CAPE process in which institutions can define what they think are their own credible assessments. And they can do validity studies on their own assessments. And then that will count towards their accreditation.